competition. It's a Wednesday afternoon ice cream social at the snack.
Oh, I see.
We don't have ice cream here. They have ice cream. Okay. All right. Thank you for coming. I'm really excited today to meet all the gentlemen here. I'll call it the builders of the Stanford Student Observatory. The observatory was built in the 1970s, and that was a very special times at Stanford, in the old universities. Everything was in turmoil. There was Vietnam War, demonstration against it, counterculture events were happening all over the place. People open to all sorts of new things, and one of the outcome of that Stanford decided to start some programs which had acronyms like Astrophysics and SCIRE, where a student can, motivated the student can start a project and build something or do something away from just mainly academic program. And our builders here were some of those motivated, high-achieving students. We started one of those programs, and they built the observatory within a couple of years, which is amazing feat. It's every time I think about it, I'm surprised how they did this. And they will actually tell us about how the whole process happened. I want to say a few words what happened to the observatory afterwards, after it was built. I think you guys taught the first courses there. Yeah?
Yes.
And then Professor Meyerhof, who was the chairman of the physics department at that time, was instrumental getting these guys to build the telescope. And but at that time, there was no astrophysics in the physics department, no astrophysicists in the physics department. We were just beginning to build astrophysics community in the applied physics department. I came here in 1969, probably the only first card-carrying astrophysicist, or the first one to come to Stanford. Anyway, we were building astrophysics there. So then it was this. We were teaching in applied physics. We had no undergraduate courses, but I started and the others started teaching undergraduate courses. So we needed a means to do this. So that's why we established and founded the astronomy program, an independent astronomy program at the School of Humanities and Sciences. And since astrophysics were there and no astrophysics in physics, so the administration of the telescope became the part of the astronomy program. And initially, Art Walker, who had joined the applied physics department, was teaching it. He was the chair of the astronomy program. And then after he became dean, he was too busy. I took over, and we had the astronomy program running for a long time. Eventually, it did the fit of astrophysics in applied physics didn't seem to be correct. So what happened that after a couple of visiting committees discussing what is the future of astrophysics Stanford going to be, was decided that all astrophysics should be in physics department. And in 1990s, we all moved into physics department, and the astronomy program came to the physics department and became part of the physics, and now essentially physics administration rather than the telescope and the astronomy program. Okay, you'll hear more from the beginning of the building of the observatory from the builders here, and then Roger Romani and Keith, who did more improvement on that. They talk after that. But so now I want to introduce them. So as I said, those SWAPC programs attract well-motivated, highly motivated, and high-achieving students who do such a program. And our builders were certainly that, and they continued in the rest of their life to be high achievers and very successful in the fields, different fields they come from. So let me introduce them quickly. I don't want to take too much time, give time to them to talk. So, in the order of alphabetically, Michael Kast, the one sort of the instrumentalist in the group, had interest in telescopes at a very young age. At the 7th grade, encouragement from his teacher, he built a 6-inch ground and the 6-inch mirror for a refracted telescope. And 3 later, when in high school, he built another even bigger one, and then eventually ended up at Stanford and met Nick, and they started the process of building the telescope. So building telescope has been part of his life and continues till today. After graduating, well, he was in physics department, but that RA told him, the research teaching assistant told him he better be in the mechanical engineering, so he switched to mechanical engineering and got a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and then he actually has lived in Palo Alto most of his life, and he has his career has been focused primarily on various startups, all doing technology in solar energy, medical devices, and thin film, and also monitoring devices for electric utilities. So has had several startup companies that have been very successful. He recently retired. He left Palo Alto and to Bonnie Doon in the mountains of Santa Cruz, but he still hasn't lost his interest in building telescopes, so he's building an observatory at his house now. And it is not finished, but soon I will see some good pictures from it. Okay. Okay. Let me see. I guess Ken Kornberg was also a Stanford student and undergraduate at the same time. Some of you may know Kornberg is a face and name. His father was a Nobel Prize physicist professor at Stanford. And he saw, as a was architect student, he saw, I guess he will tell about it, how he joined this group as an architect and helped building the telescope. But after graduation from the School of Architecture, getting that bachelor and master's degree, he founded what's called Kornberg Association in 1979. This is a big company with offices or main offices at Menlo Park and Japan. And one of the main things is to building for research institutions, for universities, for government, and for companies. And he has, his company has built many things all over the world, research facilities. First, there's one at Stanford, I think, and there's several at Pasadena, La Jolla, and Palo Alto. There's college schools, college cities with college universities in them, and several things, big projects at the United States, and also all over the world, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, France, United Arab Emirates, I think, and even Israel too. So it's very successful business. The last 20 years, he has also served as a trustee in several non-profit institutions, and Geohazard. He was on the board of Geohazard International, at an NGO which worked for helping underdeveloped countries. Of course, now not only that's good for underdeveloped countries with the climate change, those services would be very useful even in all the countries all over the world. And he is currently serving as the board chair of that institution, international institution. All right, and we're glad that he could come today. Nick is the only card-carrying astrophysicist, astronomer in the group. He started at Stanford as a student in mathematics. But I think after taking, we were just beginning to teach some astrophysics courses, and he took some off there, and we decided he wanted to do astrophysics. So after getting his bachelor's degree in '74, he went to Santa Cruz and got a PhD there. He then was a postdoc at Washington, University of Washington, and the Carnegie Fellow at Mount Wilson Observatories in Pasadena. Then he moved to National Optical Astronomical Observatory, NOAO, and first as an assistant astronomer, then 4 years as an associate, and then full astronomer. And from 19 for about more than 10 years, he worked at NOAO. After 2006, he moved to Texas A&M University, where he started the astronomy program there, and in fact served as the head of the astronomy program at Texas A&M. At the same time, he was also appointed as the adjunct professor at the University of Texas in Austin. And he was work there was highly recognized and respected. He was a university distinguished professor and Regents professor at Texas A&M. He just retired recently, 2004, so it's he's just retiring. Well, he has worked, his main research has been in observational astronomy, and he is, I don't have time to talk about all his accomplishments. Here he has more than 300 reference journal articles, and he has worked in many areas of astrophysics and has received many awards for this, which again I don't have time to go through all of it.
Unknown caller.
But let me mention one thing that was very important project that he did. The last 20 years or so, most of it is concentrated on supernovae and the use of supernovae for cosmology. And with Brian Schmidt, they founded the high redshift supernova team, and this became the team was the one who eventually using supernova discovered the accelerated expansion of the universe, and some of the team members, including Brian Schmidt, Chris, and Paul got the Nobel Prize, and some people thought Nick should have been in that group, but I guess Nobel Committee doesn't give prize to 4 people, only the limit is 3 people. Anyway, that was an outstanding contribution that the Nobel Prize, but it's highly recognized and respected by the community. And Nick has served many committees, NASA, and also even he was on the DOE evaluation after Stanford KIPAC in 2007, and I hope he gave us a good recommendation for that. And we are glad that you are here. You could come and be with us today. I will say a few more words. After the time, I'm going to let them describe how they build the telescope, and then after that, maybe Roger Liz and Roger Romani and Keith will tell us renovation of telescope. When they were building the building, Astronomy was a very small group here. We were just starting, and it took a long time to things to build up. But eventually, we managed to start CHI-PAC, and since then, everything has grown exponentially. Roger Blanford led the initiation of the CHI-PAC and established the Institute as an internationally recognized place for astrophysics. Tom Abel served as a director for many years, and Lisa Wexler, with his unlimited energy, now is trying to push it to the newer heights, and she will tell us some more about, if we have time, about the pilot. So, okay, I'll stop a bit, not too long, and let you guys take over.
Thank you very much, Mike. So what we're going to do, I put a bunch of pictures together of the construction of the observatory. It's been 50 years, so all three of us don't really remember most of what went on. So it's kind of like each one of us is going to share a different story. Whether all these stories are true or not, I can't say. They've grown better in time, though, I can say that. This is obviously the observatory. Ken, you know these windows leak, right? Those are the windows.
It's the contract.
It's a contractor. Okay. Anyway, so it's hard to believe we did this. I'm not trying to brag. It just, in hindsight, this was built in 16 months here at Stanford by organized by undergraduates. Graduate students helped, the staff and faculty here in the physics department and applied physics. We all worked together and built this observatory. It officially started in 1972, and it was finished, it was dedicated in October of 1973. And so we're going to show a bunch of pictures. But Vahi said that I am a card-carrying astronomer. Actually, I am not. So I want to show you, I'm going to pass this around. This is my university card, and A&M is famous for, well, we're Aggies, so you have to give us a little bit of a break. Anyway, you can see from my card that I actually not an astronomer. You can see what they called me at this university. Anyway, so let's get on with the pictures here. So I declared as a physics undergraduate major in 1970 when I got here, and Walter Meyerhof was chairman of the physics department, and he was my advisor. And Dr. Meyerhof would come over every other week and actually eat dinner with me at Arroyo, which is where where I was, and which was tremendously great because the food was just awful at Arroyo. And so Mike came along too. Mike and I went to high school together, and sometime in that first quarter in 1970, Mike asked Walter Meyerhof, "Why do you not have astronomy here at Stanford University?" And we talked about it for a while. And then Dr. Meyerhof, out of the blue, said, "Well, why did you guys build an observatory?" And it's like, us? I mean, we're freshmen. I'm 17 years old. I mean, these Nobel laureates and everything want us to build it. And he encouraged us. He said, "Look, I'll get you the money, and I can help with the organization of the university. You put the people together, and let's build this thing." It's like, what the hell? Okay. So we had this typed up and posted this all over campus. For those of you that aren't our age, this is called a mimeograph. And it smells really good, by the way, when it's made, but you have to be really old to know that. So I posted this all over campus. Astronomy is looking up at Stanford, an awful pun, but we're 17, 18 years old. An organizational meeting will take place on Thursday, February 25th in Physics 104 to see what interest there is in astronomy. And a bunch of people came, including Ken. And this is how it started. What year was it? This was 1971 that this came out. The conversation with Dr. Meyerhof was in 1970. So just one other thing. Mike and I went to high school together. We were at Redwood High School in Larkspur. And I just wanted to show this great picture because here's Mike I'm pointing to Mike over here. But there's a really famous person in this picture with a question mark. Can anyone recognize that person?
I can.
You can.
Robin Williams?
It's Robin Williams. So Mike was on the same cross-country team as Robin Williams, and he was an extremely good runner. So I don't know why they cut your heads off. But anyway, so that's our background. We went to the same high school in Marin County. Some pictures of Dr. Walter Meyerhof. He was an experimentalist in nuclear physics, worked in, I believe, a 10 Van de Graaff generator. And then I've got some pictures of Ken and Mike working together on the drawings for the observatory. This is my meal card from Stanford. And Greg Howell, who is the missing fourth person here, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, was a CD when he came here to Stanford University. And he was really the genius behind the construction. After he finished the observatory and went on into his career, he ended up creating a type of philosophy in construction engineering called lean construction. And if you've never heard of it, you just type in lean construction, you'll find all sorts of pages on how you can do construction in the most efficient fashion. So Greg Howell became very famous in the construction science field. And so he was a wonderful person to work with. What was his philosophy, Mike?
He was a master's
student
in construction management.
Construction management.
Group, which was in the civil engineering.
Right. So what was his philosophy about, teaching people?
Yeah, well, he had just come from working in a place called Arco Santi, which was a new city where students could actually pay tuition to come and work for free. And so he had direct experience for almost a year teaching uneducated or untrained, educated maybe, but untrained students how to build things. So from that, he was fully qualified to help us out. And yes, his philosophy was you should let your students make their own mistakes up to the point of hurting themselves.
So anyway, these were the four main people who were involved in it.
One
But
of the
this,
stories is about somebody, there was some operation or something they were doing there. Something is doing at Arco Santi. Paolo Soleri was the architect and visionary that was creating this new city. It was out in the middle of the desert. The idea was to create a whole new city and culture. And they were lifting some beam or something, and somebody ran over to give Paolo Soleri a hard hat. And Greg said, "Don't waste the hard hat." There was suspicion that what he had designed was going to fall down.
just one other point about what was going on. I mean, Mike was mentioning that it was the 70s. President Lyman was president of the university. There were sit-ins in his office. People were trashing Hoover Tower. There were sit-ins on the university in the market area, blocking the roads. There was tear gas around the campus. It was really interesting, chaotic times. And this was also, in a sense, a interesting and chaotic project that somehow came all together. Now, Walter Mike.
One of the things that Lyman did in the spring of '72 was he eliminated the Stanford architecture and
Yes,
speech and
that's
drama
right.
department on the same Thursday night. And for those of us who were seniors and juniors in architecture, that was a memorable evening.
You were the last architecture class for quite a long time, right?
Yeah, still am.
But they have architecture now, don't they? Or not so much? Well, let me tell you a very quick story about Walter Meyerhof. Now, Stanford University doesn't have an astronomy or astrophysics department officially. And that's actually a historical fact because Meyerhof, who was chairman, wanted to bring astronomy and astrophysics too. Astronomers and astrophysicists, they're the same subject, astronomy or astrophysics, when he spoke of them simultaneously. He wanted to bring Vahi over from applied physics, bring the solar physicists over to the physics department so that astrophysics would be part of the department. But what stood in the way was the Board of Trustees of Stanford University. Because the Board of Trustees of Stanford University, back, I believe it was in the 1930s, decided that Stanford should not have an astronomy department, whatever, observatory, because the University of California had Lick Observatory. And Caltech had Mount Wilson Observatory, and then a little later on Palomar Observatory. And so Stanford didn't want to compete. They wanted to spend the resources elsewhere. So when Meyerhof went to the Board of Trustees pitching to bring, to bring all of astronomy into the same area, he was stonewalled by the Board of Trustees, trotting out like a 50-year-old document saying that Stanford shall not have astronomy because, for the reasons that they didn't want to compete with the University of California. And that really frustrated him. So he wanted to find ways to get around that. And he told me this well after the observatory was built. And one of the ways to get around this was to support the building of a small observatory, however it was get built, in this case by undergraduates and graduate students. And so this was his way of shoehorning in astronomy into this university, getting around the Board of Trustees. Dr. Meyerhof was going to help us with the funding, and so we thought it was going to cost $5,000, but in the end it cost a lot more. And we got a lot of funding from the university fellows, the provost, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Physics. Mike and I are still arguing if the Bechtel Corporation gave us money or not. Do you think they did? Didn't I think they did? Mike is quoted here in one of the articles saying that...
This isn't a very nice quote, by the way.
Oh, I love the quote. We don't have a diary. It just got to the point when no one could stop him without messing someone else up. I'll let you read the rest of it. But that was kind of the philosophy. It was like, somehow it hung all together. So it didn't cost that much money, but it cost a lot more than we thought it was going to. So, Ray, Mike, you tell the story about the crane.
Okay.
Well.
How about if Ken tells the story about how we got the steel first, and then we'll talk about the crane.
Okay.
So can you go to the picture that has the I-beams in it?
Yeah. This one?
Okay, that's a good one.
Oh, great.
But turn around.
So you guys may have to fill me in a little, but the steel, we realized we wanted steel to support the platform, which is independent of the building down below. And that platform then has the pipe that the mount for the telescope sits, and that's independent of that.
Hello, everybody.
But when we started looking at the height we needed, we realized that the steel would be extremely expensive, even though we wanted to build something that substantial. So Mike and I went to, well actually, first I went to SLAC because Bob Hofstadter, who was also helping us, giving us advice, and he was a physics professor at that time, and he had a Navy grant, and he said, well, go to SLAC. I've heard that they have some steel. And so I went over there and I found just the right stuff. It was lying out, half covered by weeds, just rusting away, and measured it, and I realized that this was more than we needed, but it was just perfect for us. The right dimension I-beam, the web size and the flame size. And so Bob then introduced me to the head of the SLAC facilities in charge. And I said, if there's some way we could get the steel, because it's just sitting out there rotting, and it would really be terrific for us. It would just take care of all our needs of the project. He said, no way, that's our steel, and we may be using that someday. I was just looking at this stuff. So Bob then got us access to, and I'll show you a picture of a slide of it, an island next to Stockton, which was the depot for bridges and all kinds of things coming back from Vietnam. And when we went there, we went into the sort of the main building there, and then they opened the door, we go, and as far as we can see, is just stuff. And we saw it. And Bob Hofstadter said, you can have anything you want, just tell them and I'll put on my grant, take care of it. And I saw so much steel. I mean, we walked for well over an hour just seeing the first quarter of the area, and there were I-beams all over the place. So I marked about a dozen of them. And they weren't quite right for us, and we didn't know how we were going to get it back from South Carolina. But then we saw a couple of Jeeps, so we decided we'd take a Jeep, and then we saw this U2 camera. I said, whoa, look at that. And so we just picked up anything that was like kids in a candy shop, and we just couldn't believe all the things that were there. So we put together this, they gave us a little clipboard, and we put together a list of all the things we wanted, and submitted it and came back. And I don't know whose idea it was, but we told Bob Hofstadter about it. He said, well, why don't you just trade it, people at Slack. So I went to this same, he was a ex-Navy procurement guy at Slack who was in charge of all the materials. And he said, I'll talk to him first. And so I go into his office and I said, remember that steel? And he said, yes, I remember that steel. That was unfair. Because Bob had already arranged for him to trade it for us. So that gets to the point where you guys took over. Because
We would call that liberating steel. So,
Yeah, so with Greg Howell, he really was a seasoned builder of large stuff. Had many stories about building with insufficient equipment on critical tasks. And these I-beams, I think, were something like 32 feet long. And the crane that he borrowed from Ron Bracewell's group had a boom that was 25 feet long. But that was no big problem for Greg. We bored the foundations that are solid sandstone into the ground about 6 or 8 feet. And he had our welder, Bill, grab onto the ears of the I-beams very low. And he was able to just barely hold on to the I-beams with the crane, slide it at an angle into the hole in the ground, and then once it was in the hole in the ground, he could lift it up vertically. It was very graceful, but not code.
yeah, I remember at one point he was doing something and he jumped out of the crane just in case the stuff would fall back on him. So it was quite amazing watching him. So anyway, so this became a class. The enrollment was typically 15 students. Although the groundbreaking was in 1972, the first year was basically the organization, which Mike and Greg did a lot of talking to the university officials.
Ken.
Talking to the university officials, trying to get permits. Some of the permits took a long time. The final permit, I think, was only given a few days before the construction started. But as you said, I think it was remarkable how fast the permits went.
I got the permit for that in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
The building permit. And it wasn't any skill of mine. Gene Kirshner was the administrative person in the development office, I guess, and he said, you're gonna have to get a permit for this. And I said, okay. So I went down to, it's a county facility. And so I went, and there was this really nice man, and I showed him what I had, which was just the sort of the floor plans and some elevations. And he said, here's what you need. And he wrote on a piece of his lunch bag, I need plan, I need a section, I need elevation, and come back with it. And so I came back a week later, drawn a little more. And he took the drawings, he said, okay, do what I said. And he walked me through the fire department, the planning department, the building department, health and safety, and he just put it down in front of each of these people and they stamped it. And that day I walked out with a permit.
Just the way it is.
Never again.
It's not quite like that.
You know, a little bit more about Gene. He also helped us identify where the observatory might go. Yeah. And if you're wondering why it's on the golf course, that's because Ken and I spent lots of hours driving or hiking around the radio dish hill and found the perfect place, which was at the south end, not near the golf course. But as it turned out, in order to build the observatory there, we'd have to have a water line that was 500 yards long or something, and that was triple the budget of the whole thing. So I said, well, I should put it down by the golf course. And so it's by the golf course. However, years later, Greg Howell and others worked on the Wilcox Solar Observatory, and they took that site.
how did we get the pier? What's the story about the pier?
So the architecture department faced the aero-astro department. And for some reason, they were doing a renovation. And in the renovation, they were getting rid of that column.
Turn around, Ken.
I'm sorry. In the renovation, they wanted to get rid of that column. I was coming out of the architecture department, it was sort of late at night, and I saw this column there, and there were stacks of concrete and rebar and drywall, and they were going to haul it away the next day and just throw it out. And so I ran back and made a sign and said, please do not take this, and I taped it to it, and I said, call this number. And then the next morning I came back and borrowed my dad's car, and I pulled some of the stuff away, and I made sure it was obvious that we wanted that piece. And then I called Mike and Greg, and I said, take a look at this, see if this thing will work for us for the telescope. And I said, yeah. And then I went to the contractor, and he said, I really think that's a valuable piece of equipment there. So we paid him $200, and he let us haul it away. And I don't know how it got hauled away.
Yeah, we borrowed somebody's forklift and got it onto a facilities truck. I think the physics department had a flatbed truck at that time and drove it up. But it just happened to be exactly the right height. It's a double-walled steel vessel.
It was
with
hollow.
vermiculite on the inside.
Yeah, but you filled it with concrete.
Yeah.
So there was a port at one height.
Right, at about 5 feet.
Where the exhaust came in.
Right.
It was a smokestack.
Mhm.
Later, I think someone in Aero wondered where it went, and they asked, well, could we get it back? And it's like, okay, but there's cement in it, yes.
plus.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your idea and the design? How did you come up with this design?
Sure.
Turn around.
I have to look at it first. Well, a lot of the design was impacted by what we could get hold of. And so we got that steel, and that sort of started to form the upper platform. But really, you have to start with a program, start with a plan. So Mike and Nick put together all the things they needed, and we worked together and came up with rough floor plans. And I have a picture of what inspired me to come up with some of those forms, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. But the idea was to have this lower area, which was where people could sleep and do things that didn't require being next to the telescope. And then the telescope was on a separate isolated platform. And I'll show you a picture of the idea that got onto that wood form that goes around it. But really, it's a combination of things. The site itself is just a gorgeous site. You're surrounded by these oak trees and the grass, and then you can see the mountains. And it was something you just felt compelled to make sure that we protected that. I don't think we touched any part of any of the oak trees, and we just needed a clear shot of the north exposure, and that's how it got there. But then, well, I'll talk about it a little bit.
Here's the architect in front of the building. It really is a gorgeous building. It's iconic on this campus. I've had two students at Texas A&M who came from Stanford and used the observatory. And one of them, when I told him that I helped build it, he said, wow. And I never quite understood what that meant. It was either like, wow, that's really cool you did that, or wow, I didn't realize it was that old. Anyway, the design has stood the test of time. It still is a gorgeous design. So there's a picture, a kind of poor picture taken from a newspaper of Mike in front of the observatory. Then in October 1973, the Board of Regents came out to bless the observatory. And here is President Lyman over here and Dr. Walter Meyerhof over here. And then another picture from the same Stanford news release. You can see President Lyman, Mike, and Dr. Meyerhof, and Mike is explaining something about the telescope to some board of trustees. it was, again, this was 16 months after construction started. And you can see the mount that came from Bowler and Chevins that you guys got from Southern California to Rockwell. And the observatory was almost ready to go at that time.
Yeah, let me interject a little story about Bracewell and that mount. So the mount is a really very significant part of the observatory, of course. We had no plan on how to make one or buy one because they're really very expensive. I think Meyerhof probably directed us to go talk with Ron Bracewell, and I didn't know who Ron Bracewell was. Now I do. But we had a very short conversation, and he listened to what we were looking for. We were just sort of scrounging for anything. And of course, Bracewell had the whole radio telescope array out on Portola Valley Road, all kinds of equipment. He picks up the phone and gets somebody in the Stanford Industrial Park, I recall, and said, "Do you guys still have that tracking mount?" Great. That was it. Yeah. And then we went, along with the mount came refurbishing it at the facilities that they had down in Pasadena to do that. So I thought I went down there with Nick, but apparently not. He doesn't remember. So we show up on a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock with a U-Haul truck. And the technicians that were ready to put this on the flatbed or whatever were just truly impressed with our lack of planning. And they spent the next 3 or 4 hours putting together these beautiful timber cradles that we then were able to load around 8 o'clock that night, and then drove up all night long up Highway 5.
How about the dome?
Oh, the dome, yeah, the dome was, who was it that put us on the dome from, Washington Observatory was the original observatory on campus, student observatory for University of California.
On campus.
On campus. And they were refurbishing it, and they were going to get rid of the dome. The dome was over 100 years old. It was a beautiful, inside there was redwood ribbing that had been carved out, and it was tinned on the inside. It was old, but
8-inch diameter ball bearings.
and so we learned about it, and we asked if we could have it, and so we liberated it from Berkeley and brought it down here. And so it was the dome for quite a while at the observatory.
We did have to cut it in half.
You would have cut in half, yes. And it didn't quite fit on the truck. It kind of was a little bit too wide, so we were worried that the CHP was going to pull us over and you give us a ticket. But somehow we got the two pieces here to Stanford. There are a lot of articles about it. At the time, it was kind of a novel thing for students to do. We even made the Russian newspaper in San Francisco.
Can you translate that for us, please?
I can comment Kahutek. And so this is the, sorry, it's too orange, but this is the announcement for the dedication on October, whatever it says here, October 9th. So there's an official dedication. The speaker was Don Osterbrock from the UC Santa Cruz and Lick Observatory. Over here are listed the members of the Astronomy and Astrophysics at Stanford: Sturrock, Bracewell, Ishelman, Hofstadter, Johnson, Meyerhof, Perkins, Petrosian, Spreiter, Walker, etc., Wilcox. So those are the people who are running the game to try to get astronomy back into the fold here in the physics department. And this is the final slide I'm going to show. I'm going to reserve 5 minutes at the very end of this because I want to tell a very personal story, a really nice story about Vaughey and his influence later on in my work in cosmology and the discovery of the accelerated expansion of the universe. Anyway,
Do you think that was taken with the telescope?
no, I couldn't find what we took.
Okay.
So we built the thing, but we really didn't know how to do astronomy, and all we had was a film camera. So we started taking black and white pictures of stuff. And Comet Kahutek was the big comet. It's going to be the comet of the century. There was on national, international news, and we took a reasonably good picture of it with our black and white film camera, probably using T-Max. And somehow Stanford publicity got a hold of it, and they publicized that we had a great picture of this comet. And although you don't remember it, it really happened. We got contacted, I'm almost certain, by ABC News. And so our picture taken from the observatory back in 1973, was presented on national news, on the nightly news or whatever it was at that time. And so that was our first and only foray into what the observatory could do, and then we graduated afterwards. So that's where I'm going to end this right now. Ken, you're going to show some pictures now?
Yeah, it's a little repetitive, so I'll go through pretty quickly.
Thanks, Nick.
So I was telling you that when you're an architect and you are given a site as gorgeous as that, a lot of things go through your mind that you don't want to mess it up. But also the clues as to what I felt was important were right there. That it was a gorgeous site. We had a little area that we could fit it into, sort of step down a hill. We needed a high platform and then the lower area. Because the lower area might be heated and the upper wasn't, they were separate. And this building, which exists right now on 3133 El Camino Real, it's on the corner of Portage and El Camino, is, I really love this building. It didn't look like this. It was the same cedar diagonal siding that we have on our building. And it was, you walk into that box and it was completely hollow all the way up, and it was called the Record Store, later become Banana Records. And it was just something I really admired. So when we, the wrong way, sorry. So you have to picture that other building with the same horizontal siding as that. And I wanted something that fit into nature because it was such a, such a natural site that I really wanted to have something that felt like it belonged there. So in terms of color and texture and material, the trees really dominated the feeling of that place. But this was a picture that, this is Rough and Ready Island, which is where Mike and I went. And we came, this is called Navy Drive. And there was this building here. There was nothing in this lot. And it's over a mile long. And it was just filled with things that were just, we didn't know what to do when we first got there. So we just started walking around, but it was just remarkable. Now this is TSA, as you can see, and they have a landing strip here, so I don't know what they really do with it now. So the other thing that was so fortuitous with this was, you'll see a picture later of the trunks of these trees. The structure of the trees and the structure of this building really played off each other quite well. And it was just part of the idea of nestling this into that very small area. And we had a little extra steel. We had to cut a couple of beams, and so we ended up supporting this with this cantilever with those beams that were left over. And as far as the eyebrows, which you pointed out leak, I now know why they leak, but I didn't know detailing or waterproof detailing at that stage, Brian.
Greg knew they were going to leak as soon as we finished.
So why didn't he do
Well,
it?
he said, no, he realized that we had done it all wrong.
I see.
The flashing was all wrong.
Yeah, well, the flashing
knew it was gonna
should
leak.
go under the siding and then curl out
Yeah,
over
well,
the
someone else
top.
fixed that problem later.
Did it get fixed?
I don't know.
So this was it from down below. And then this is the inside, and it was, again, extremely utilitarian. There was nothing really, no blemishes or extra things on it. It was just a space that served the needs that you two described. And we put in windows because
Ken, can you stop on that slide for just a second? So, there on the website for the Stanford Observatory, there's some really nice pictures of the refurbished mount getting dropped into place with enormous crane. And I want to mention that Greg lifted up that mount in 2 pieces with $50 hand ratchet winches through a porthole, a little hatch that's on the floor. So he had a beam spanning that open space and a ratchet on one side and a ratchet winch on the other side. And 2 of us just cranked it up into place.
How did you put the dome on the top?
That needed a big crane. Yeah.
Okay.
And then you guys welded it back together, or you seamed it?
You know, we had to glue we had to make a new plywood
Ring.
base for it all the way around.
No, that was amazingly well done. And it worked. I mean, it worked.
It kind of worked. I'll have to add another observatory dome story though.
Sure.
The dome was in place and a big storm was coming through, and someone mentioned, gosh, it's a good thing the dome's in place, you know, everything's battened down and ready to go. And I was sitting there thinking, I don't think we clamped it down. So I ran up and went to Hubbard and Johnson hardware store, which was a portable hardware store where the medical clinic is now. And we put a bunch of C-clamps around it, which held it in place until we did it properly. There were a lot of moments like that.
I think that's all I have. We haven't already talked about
One more architectural story, then I'll add, and then I'll be quiet. You mentioned that the downstairs might be heated. I don't think the downstairs is heated. Maybe it's
it. It
changed.
still is not?
Yeah, I don't know.
That's good.
But at the time, it wasn't heated. And we had this incredible freeze that actually froze a whole lot of the big eucalyptus on campus. I think it was like 74 or something like that. Well, it also froze the heads of the fire suppression system. And that lower area that's all in concrete was filled with water, making it one of the very few observatories with a pool.
Okay.
Roger? Sure.
All right.
Vahe, did you want to finish this up at 4:30? Are we?
No, we don't
Okay.
have limit. Time.
So I've been asked to say a few words about the Middle Ages. I don't have much from the heroic early days of this effort, which you've just been hearing about. But when I can tell you a few stories about how we refurbished the observatory in the late 90s. So when I got here in 91, Walter Meyerhof was the chairman at the time. Heard about this observatory up the hill, went up and took a look and did a few observations with it, and was going, boy, this is getting a little dated. Around about that time, I had a couple of very energetic undergraduates, and I came into a little bit of money, and so we decided to get some CCD cameras and bring them up there. Now at that time, the old Ballers and Shivens mount was still there, and mounted on it was, I think, one of those old orange tube C14s and then a very long refractor. And so we put the CCD system on that, and we started to try to take some images, and we realized the mount was completely shot. The gears were hopeless. The point is that at that time, the observatory was being run as a very active student involvement place where a lot of students could come and take the class. It was all done on film, hybrid film that they hybrid in the downstairs room and then developed in the little dark rooms that they had downstairs. And so it was all based on photographic film measurements. At that time, Art Walker was doing all the instruction. It was, I don't know how to put this. Perhaps some of you know that at Stanford, the football team has a list of what they call courses of interest. The observatory course became a course of interest. This meant that the academic rigor was perhaps not the highest level at that time, but it was a lot of fun. So there was a lot of pizza parties up there and a fair amount of late night entertainments, while a few people would go upstairs and try to take images. But the imaging was very, very challenging at that time. They really could do very little because it was impossible to track. You had to use film. So when I got some electronic instrumentation on it, we realized that we were really kind of shot in that, this is a beautiful building, a beautiful site, a beautiful facility. We really should do something to update it so that it can continue to serve students, not just as a party house, but also as a way to learn a bit about astronomy and kind of get introduced to astrophysics. And so I started thinking about what we could do, and then we made some plans in the late 90s to try to get a refurbish the mount and to get a new optic, a new telescope on it. So we did that work, and I think Rick Pan was a major help in this phase of the project. In fact, I think you were the one who arranged for the crane that finally pulled the old mount out and got it sent off.
Yeah, I couldn't find any ratchet co-ops.
Right, yeah. And I have to say that even in that era, while we could get away with some things, the university was much tighter about permits and the things that you were allowed to do. So we really could not get away with the kind of stuff that you guys clearly did in the early days. And it's gotten even worse since then. The bureaucracy has gotten to the point where the latest refurbishment, which you'll hear about from Keith and Anthony in a little bit, has become a real challenge. But we still did manage to get a fair amount done with very little money, mostly contributed by the astronomy program and the physics department. What we did was I shopped around and found companies who were eager to get into the game and perhaps were not big names at all. And so we got a bid from a small engineering company over in Fort Wayne, Indiana to refurbish the Ballers and Shivens mount. And I have to say they did a beautiful job, but they lost their shirts on this thing. So they managed to take them out, do a whole new set of gearings, put electronic control computer in and encoders on the whole system, and really bring it up to snuff, because it's a beautiful piece of steel, that amount, and it really can track a quite substantial aperture if it's treated appropriately. So we got that refurbished. I also got a company, Taurus Precision Optics, I think it was called at the time, would no longer exist either, to bid on a 24-inch telescope. So we had a 0.6 meter telescope that was put in at the time. And what we did was we got them to construct the telescope. You'll see it's still up there. And it was a big step up in aperture, but also in capability. It's a kind of an unusual design that I put together where we have the head ring can be actually flipped over, and so instead of it can be used for cast grain observations usually, but by flipping the head ring, there's a secondary that sends out to a Newtonian port. And with a coma corrector, it was a very fast F3 system with a nice wide field of view. So that, plus some much more modern electronic cameras, really took a big step up in the capabilities of things we could do at the observatory. That all came together in 98, 99, and I think we first started teaching classes again there in about 2000. Plenty of tales out of school I could tell about that process. And I think the thing is, as I mentioned, we didn't have a lot of resources to work with at that time. And so we did manage to get together just enough to get this mount refurbished and to get the optics, but the rest of it had to be done with sweat equity. And so Rick and I and a bunch of students and others got up, spent many, many hours, many, many nights up there putting this thing together and making it work. And when it finally did work, it was really almost professional level mini observatory. The dome tracked, everything monitored. You could observe from downstairs in the warm room instead of doing everything up in the cold. And it was really kind of fun, but it really wasn't as robust as one might desire. And so over the love that the students give it over the last 20 or so years, the thing really has suffered quite a bit. And so the latest, in about about 20 years after we got it going, things were starting to be very difficult to keep the telescope in an operational state. We did manage to get a second dome put outside, and that small dome hosted at that time, 16-inch that was donated to the university by David Siminoff. And we set that up with the argument that this would be an ADA facility because it was at ground level, so we made a path and a concrete pier so that could be mounted at ground level. That worked pretty well, and it certainly relieved some of our pressure on the main observatory so we could afford to have the classes work even when things were down with the 24-inch telescope. But there were some challenges in getting that sited and permitted, which I can tell you about in private later. I do want to mention, though, that this 24-inch, which I hope those of you who go up later this afternoon will get a chance to see, really did take a big step up, not only in the kind of things that students could do. We set up a bunch of observing projects where they could, measure quasar redshifts at 3 and a bit, take some images of gravitational lensing, asteroids and planet occultations, of course, all the classic things that one could do. But the story for those of you in astronomy know, the step where you go from film to electronic instrumentation is basically a factor of 100 in sensitivity. It's basically a factor of 100 in the effective area of the telescope that you're working with. And so by putting electronic instrumentation for a spectrograph and cameras on this 24-inch telescope, we could start to duplicate some of the classic experiments that were done with the professional telescopes of the 50s and 60s. And so it was a lot of fun for students to be able to measure redshifts, to be able to measure rotation curves, to do orbits of binaries, all the kind of classic things that people used to do with the world's largest telescopes of about 50 years before. Well, I did manage to do a few actual science observations with this thing, and it was a little bit of a stunt. At around about the, I guess, mid-90s or so, when Fermi was up and going, one of the more exciting things that we discovered with the Fermi telescope was a large number of a class of weird pulsars called spider binaries, where the neutron star, which is a very energetic millisecond pulsar, is evaporating, frying its companion, blowing material off of that. And as that companion gets fried, then the cloud of ionized plasma that gets spewed around the orbit hides the pulsar from normal observations. Now, gamma rays punch right through, but the radio was completely blocked for many of these systems. And so not many had been discovered until Fermi got in the sky, where it started finding pulsar-looking things in the sky that didn't have known pulsars at location. So one of the projects I took on when I was participating with Fermi a lot was trying to figure out what these missing objects in the bright source list that looked like pulsars, but there was nobody could find pulsars in those locations. These turned out, as I say, to be these so-called spider binaries, where the companion's being evaporated and that shrouds the pulsar, except in the gamma ray band in most cases from the observer. But one of the effects of this frying is that you have a companion, a low mass object, a low mass star in some cases, in other cases a planetary mass object, that's orbiting around the pulsar with orbital periods of a few hours. And one side of that is being blasted by the neutron star and heated up to stellar kind of temperatures, while the other side is, at a few hundred degrees Kelvin. So that means that as this thing orbits around, as you observe it over the course of several hours, you will find how bright it appears varies by a factor of 100 or more. And a few of these objects were actually close enough that we could observe them at the Student Observatory. So I made a point when we did one of the first discoveries of one of these objects to try to do the photometry for measuring the orbital period. I would go up there at night and try to measure just as it came over maximum, where at the Student Observatory we could just measure its light curve, and did enough of those that I could get the orbital period. And then I took our professional telescope at the time, which was the Hobby Everly telescope down in Texas that we were members of at that time, which you guys are still involved with. And I took the spectroscopy to measure the mass of the system and the orbital period. So I got a publication out of this Student Observatory telescope using the smallest aperture I had access to, 0.6 meters, and the largest aperture I had access to, 10 meters, all in one paper. That was kind of fun.
That was the Astrophysical Journal. Right?
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, we actually had an even more fun project that I did with my colleague here, Blas Cabrera, who is, as you know, one of the wizards of the basement there over in Varian, of developing all sorts of exciting instrumentation. He and his student at the time, Ken Irwin, had developed a new kind of device called a transition edge sensor, which is a super sensitive bolometer and could be used for measuring very weak signals. We figured out how to make it into an optical sensor where it could detect individual optical photons. Not only detect the photons, but measure the energy of each individual photon. And so we were able to take that device and make a prototype camera system based and we decided it was time to do a little bit of astronomy with it. And so we took it and we took the dilution refrigerator up to the Student Observatory, put it in the basement downstairs, ran fiber optics up through the pier up to the top, placed us on a telescope. I built a system that we could do acquisition with, and we made measurements of a number of objects, including a very nice observation of the bright crab pulsar. And so we did the first sort of multispectral, light curves, phase resolve spectroscopy of the pulsar with the Teaching Observatory, and that was also in the Astrophysical Journal as a nice publication. So not only did it become a big step up in the capability of the facility, allowing students at Stanford to participate in modern astrophysics in a very, I think, meaningful way. Certainly for the ones who are just there to take pretty pictures, they got better pretty pictures because the thing was much more sensitive with the cameras. But for the students who went on to become professional astrophysicists, and there have been quite a few in the last 15 or 20, well, I'll call it 30 now years, the opportunity to use at a small scale a facility that kind of mimicked what you would do at a real professional observatory, I think was really valuable. Got some of them excited enough that would go on to graduate school and become real astrophysicists, and even gave them enough experience that when they came in, they could at least have had in a small way the experience of doing so-called professional astronomy. So I think it was a very effective facility with this upgrade, and not only in serving the campus as a whole by letting a lot of people take pretty pictures, but by sparking the interest of young folks who wanted to get involved in astrophysics. and fill that gap, which, as you mentioned, as Stanford had for quite a while, and is only now being really, I think, finally filled with the advent of KIPAC and the growth of the wide activity in astrophysics going on now. I don't know, Risa, how many people would you say are involved? There's got to be 100.
200.
200 people doing astronomy and astrophysics related things. From the handful you heard about in those early days where these guys were putting it all together, there are now 200 odd folks trying to do astrophysics. And I would argue that that student observatory was one of the spurs that made that happen. So thank you very much.
Is anyone else?
You want to come up, Kate?
Yeah, sure. I have some slides, but I don't think I'll fiddle around with getting them on the screen. The screen has disappeared anyway. So I just wanted to say a few words about more recent history. I took over management of the observatory in 2004, I think. Basically, Roger had been, doing a lot of work with it, but, he has his research and students to handle and whatnot. So they needed someone a little lower on the chain. I was a research scientist at the time. So I took over just managing and keeping it running. As Roger mentioned, the new telescope, or the new, at the time, telescope, was not super robust, shall we say. It was patched together from pretty nice parts, and it worked pretty well, but it was not a foolproof instrument. So it takes a lot of care and feeding. So, and that's what I was doing. We also had the 16-inch Meade telescope in a ground level observatory dome, just 100 feet down the road, down the path. But in the process there, I did make some upgrades. We added a spectrometer, a slit spectrometer, additional baffling, things like that. But basically, we just kept things running so that the students could get interesting and useful data. But it was always an issue because we really, the smaller telescope was technically accessible by someone in a wheelchair. It still wasn't inviting. And a few years ago, we actually had a donor, an anonymous donor, so I have no clue of who this person is, who was interested in disabled access to the observatory. And that actually coincided with our desire to get an upgraded telescope facility there. So in the end, what we did was we put together a package that involved replacing the little dome, the whole little dome, and mount and telescope with a whole new facility. And because of permitting issues and the fact that it was bisected by a division line between two different county divisions, so that there were actually two different sets of rules that applied to that site. We were unable to make it any bigger. But yet, we managed to get a 0.7 meter telescope in the same footprint as the old 16-inch or 0.4 meter telescope. And that worked, it is working very well now. So this is an Altaz mount, so it doesn't really take up much room. Of course, it is all computer controlled, and in fact, everything is computer controlled. So eventually we will be able to do remote observing there, 100% remote observing in theory, because the dome can be opened and closed through an internet link, etc. But the other thing is that the main building has been upgraded. It's gone through, about 15 years ago, we had a bit of a spruce up there, but this time they actually took out and rebuilt an area that had 2 dark rooms and the bathroom, and they put in a proper ADA rated bathroom, so that's up to code now and can be accessible by someone in a wheelchair, which was really part of this whole effort. And now there's a real parking lot outside that has room for 1 wheelchair capable van. With the new big telescope now being at ground level, and it's a much nicer telescope than the old one that Roger helped put together, we are now in a position that if we can ever get to expanding our astronomy course program, which got cut back quite a bit with COVID, we will be in a very good position there for handicapped access. I guess handicapped is not the right word anymore, but disabled access to the observatory facilities.
All right, thank you.
I will only take 3 minutes. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Risa Wexler. I'm the director of CAIPAC, and as Roger mentioned, we're now about 200 people doing astrophysics here at Stanford. So I want to thank the 3 of you for giving us such a wonderful start. And I also just wanted to share a few of the very exciting activities that we've now been doing, actually using the Student Observatory. CAIPAC now has a full-time outreach and engagement manager, and we have a lot of activities, including a monthly public lecture series that we do hybrid, in person, and on YouTube. And we recently started to do regular events at the Student Observatory. So actually this fall, I think we're planning 5 events at the Student Observatory. Every time we have an event, either for the Stanford community or the broader community, we reach our capacity immediately. We had hoped to do such an event tonight, but the weather is not cooperating. You're always welcome if you're in town the next time we do that. It's really fun, and I think it's been an amazing experience, amazing training experience for our graduate students. Anthony here and Viraj, who was here earlier, are a few of the graduate students at CAIPAC who have been really engaged in the Student Observatory. The other exciting news at CAIPAC is that for the first time we now have access to a world-leading telescope. We have Magellan access starting next semester, and the Student Observatory is a great training ground for our students, as Roger already mentioned, in really being able to get access to, get hands-on experience using something like that. So I want to thank you all, and it's exciting to see where this has all gone in the last 50 years.
I think I'm going to close this, if you will indulge me. Can we get the screen to go down? Is there a button here for that? So this is a story I've never told anyone except a few friends, but it's a very important and personal story to me. This is a story about Petrosian and the 2011 Nobel Prize in Physics. This is the Nobel Prize in Physics that was awarded to the discovery of the accelerated expansion of the universe. So the only class I took in astrophysics here at Stanford University was the class in cosmology, well, in astrophysics, but a lot of it was cosmology, Hydrogen Astronomy, AP 261, and it was in the spring of 1973. Vahi had us, all the students, there were 8 of us students, take notes in class, and then afterwards we'd all get together, try to figure out what Vahi said, correct it, put it together, gave it back to him. He would have the secretary type it up, we would get it back, make corrections, and he would correct our corrections, and ultimately it was made into this book. And I've carried this book around with me my whole professional life, and I still have it. And it was very, very important for me, because in this book, Vahi discussed a lot in cosmology about H0 and Q0. And the thing is that the cosmological constant was in great disrepute at that time. If you go to Meissner, Thorne, and Weaver, there are about 3 or 4 pages about the cosmological constant, and there's nothing else. When I took GR in graduate school, Bill Burke wrote down the field equation and immediately crossed out the lambda term, and I never saw it again in general relativity. But in this book, I was introduced the concept of looking at the kinematical parameters of cosmology. These aren't physical parameters. These are measuring the Hubble constant, the expansion of the universe, and the deceleration of the universe, which are not really velocities and accelerations. They're just parameters that come out of the theory. And Vahi, when he taught this class, made us understand that fitting these parameters is different than saying you've measured the cosmological constant or some interpretation of the parameters. So when I was taking this class, I learned from the class that you could measure these parameters without having to really understand why they are there, but you could measure them and they become the kinematical parameters in cosmology. So after I went to Stanford, so these are some of the notes that we wrote up. There were 8 of us in the class. These are the 2 most famous people in our class. This is Doan Farmer, who became a famous person in chaos theory and is now a professor of economics at Oxford University. And there's Sally Ride, who was also in the class. I went afterwards to Carnegie, and Alan Sandage was my mentor. Mentor being not quite the right word used with Alan Sandage, but anyway, he was the one that got me really into cosmology. He'd always say there are only 2 numbers in astronomy. In this case, that is the Hubble constant, the expansion of the universe, and the deceleration of the universe. He had measured the Hubble constant over his life, and he wanted to measure the deceleration of the universe, but we beat him to it. So I became, in the 1980s, enamored with trying to measure these cosmological numbers. We had CCDs. I helped build CCDs at Cerro Tololo Observatory in Chile, and we were the first people to publish CCD light curves of supernovae. Type 1a supernovae were finally identified as a separate class in 1985 by J. Elias using infrared photometry. In 1986, Mark Phillips and I started taking data of the brightest supernovae using CCDs. The first supernova was 1986G, and the next important one was 1989b. Now, the reason why those 2 nearby supernovae were important was that the light curve of these supernovae rose to maximum light and fell away from maximum light much more quickly than typical types of these supernovae. And they also appeared dimmer, so this gave us the idea that there was an old idea coming from Sofsky in 1977 that the peak brightness of the supernova was somehow associated with the broadness of the curve. And so whenever there's a bright supernova, we took data on it, so this is all our CCD data. In 1989, we put together the Colon-Tololo project, where we wanted to go out and get a sample of supernovae that were discovered early on, and then measured it with CCD detectors and get spectroscopy. And so this was our final diagram of the 29 or so type 1a supernovae. This is redshift, and this is the brightness of the supernova, and there's a really perfect linear relationship. So this shows that there is a way of using the shape of the light curve to come up with a very accurate distance. The distance is 1/2 the dispersion here, so we were able to get distances to 5 to 6%, which was revolutionary in cosmology. The best distances were about 25% using Tully-Fisher. So once we had enough data, we could measure H0. We didn't have the final Cepheid calibration, which Wendy Friedman and the H0 project had, but they used our data because we were able to define the Hubble flow to high accuracy, and they provided the anchor over here for the very nearby Cepheids. Brian and I started working on QNOT in 1993. Brian Schmidt came down in 1994. There's Brian, Pete Chalice, and me. And we decided to shift my project from the Schmidt telescope, which I built a CCD camera in prime focus in Schmidt, to working on the 4-meter telescope. And so this began the High-Z team in April 1994. And most of you know the rest of the story, that by the end of 1997, we discovered the observational evidence for the supernovae for the accelerating universe and the cosmological constant, and the companion paper that Brian and I wrote, because we were the head of the team, on the techniques that we used. So I want to get back to Vahi, because when we came up with this paper, Adam was first author because I set up the group, the High-Z group, and one of the 2 roles of the High-Z group was that the intellectual leader of whatever we were working on had to be the first author. And this guaranteed that it wasn't going to be the senior authors in our group that were always getting all the credit, but the actual people that did the work. So Adam was less than 1 year out of graduate school when this paper was written. So, but Adam and I got in a real argument over this particular paper, because Adam came out of Harvard and he studied cosmology with Bill Press. And Bill Press was using the more modern notation of omega lambda and omega matter to talk about cosmology, whereas I had learned from Vahi of using H0 and Q0. And Adam did not understand why I was so adamant that we talk about acceleration and deceleration. For him, he wanted to show that we were measuring the cosmological constant. And I told Adam, no, we're not. What we've measured is that supernovae at redshift of a half or about a quarter of a magnitude too faint. And using the FIT, we could measure the kinematical parameters of the expansion of the universe and the deceleration of the universe. The interpretations of those numbers are what you get cosmological constant. Later, Michael Turner came up with the word dark energy. But what we actually did as observers was not to measure the cosmological constant. We were there, we measured the kinematical parameters, as I had learned in Vahi's class in 1973. So we argued back and forth, and finally I got the group to state that the actual discovery was observational evidence from supernovae for an accelerating universe. And then Adam had to put on the cosmological constant part. So the Nobel Prize came out in physics, and Saul and Brian and Adam won. But the statement from the Nobel Committee for this discovery was simply this: for the discovery of the accelerating expansion of the universe through observations of distant supernovae. And so what I want to say to Vahi is the reason why the Nobel Prize reads this way and doesn't say anything about the cosmological constant is because what you taught me back in 1973, that those were the observational parameters. You were measuring these parameters. You could interpret the parameters using astrophysics and cosmological constant and so forth. But what we did was to measure these two kinematical parameters. And so ultimately, the Nobel Prize was awarded with this phrase, and this phrase goes directly back to the class that you taught me in 1973. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Actually, I had written a paper when I was graduate, possibility of accelerated universes.
Yeah, you're one of the only people back then. There was Gunn and Tinsley and a few others that would include Q0 and lambda in the papers, but everyone else was staying far away from it. So you're one of the pioneers in bringing us back into thinking of those parameters, and your class really helped. And I still have that book, and I used that when we were writing that book.
I used that book for several years every time I taught classes. It's stuff I've changed a lot, so I don't use it anymore for my classes.
Anyway, thank you very much for listening to this history.
He's an astronomer.
I knew it all the time.
Only in Texas A&M. An astrologer. I'm the only astrologist in the world.